This is a great, great opportunity to just talk a little bit about Black History Month. So excited to celebrate this with you guys and just so excited to celebrate in general because Black History Month is an opportunity to honor, too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor and throughout history. I mean, it's a way to recognize the contributions of Black Americans as well as present opportunities for people to learn the effects of racism and how to challenge negative stereotypes. But for most people, history starts, with simply learning about their family or their community. It starts right there at home a lot of times. And it's not something obscure or unimportant. History, our story, it plays a vital role in our everyday lives. We learn from our past in order to achieve greater influence over our future. It serves as a model, not only of who we are and what we want to be, but we learn what to champion and what to avoid. This everyday decision making around the world is constantly based on what came before us. That's why it's important for us to be intentional. A concerted effort to preserve our heritage is a vital link to our cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, and economic legacies, all of the things that quite literally make us who we are. So I'd love to pass it over to Lev now so that he can introduce our esteemed speaker. And thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Timothy, and thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, everybody, for participating in this prologue of this month-long celebration of Black History Month. And I'm very pleased to introduce everyone in the University Technology office to a friend and colleague, Larry Irving. Larry and I have known each other, mostly me watching him, but we actually met the first time just over 20 years ago. And very much involved, Larry has been involved in his professional life, as well as in his grassroots and community work in helping us better understand one of the great challenges of our times and a challenge for the technology community. Larry has been a clarion voice for the ethical and intentional use of technology to advance all people. And with that, friends, Larry Irving.
Thank you, Lev. And I want to thank the ASU UTO community for inviting me. This is so special. Last night Lev said, well, we've got a little business before from 6 to 6:15. You might want to come at 6:15. And I'd have hated you forever if I'd missed this 15 minutes because that was just spectacular. There's an old adage that you never want to follow kids or animals if you're doing a speech or doing any act. I'm going to add Cheryl and Warwick to that because Timothy, thank you for coming in between because I needed that cartilage. I did not want to follow Cheryl directly going to talk about technology after she has talked about beauty and life affirmation in music. And this is going to be an extemporaneous. We're going to have a conversation, not just me yakking at you. That's the other thing, Lev. Yes, I want to do slides. The last thing these folks want after this beautiful opening would be some joker sitting here throwing a bunch of slides at them. So there are no slides. You're in a slide-free hour. And it's funny because we talked about music. We opened up with Warwick, and I'm pretty old. So the three things I was going to say I'm grateful for: my family and wife, who are everything to me. The ability to have done the things I've done in my career. Growing with the projects in Brooklyn. This a Brooklyn boy, if the projects wasn't supposed to have the life I've had. But the ability to enjoy music. And just before this, I swear to you, I was listening to Chick Corea, who died today. In the 70s. I don't think there was a week that I didn't listen to Chick Corea. And when I was having a fight, like 2 minutes before I got on here, whether his time with Miles Davis's band or Return Forever was better. I think that Miles Electric was overrated, so I'm Return to Forever. If you haven't listened, please go to Spotify and listen to Chick Corea tonight. You'll love it. It's Black History Month. And I am grateful that I've had the ability to do the things I do. But I stand on the shoulders of men like Mickey Leland and Ron Brown, because when I was a kid right out of college, Mickey Leland, who's a congressman most of you have never heard of, but almost all of the work that I do traces back to things I did with Congressman Leland. Mickey was a pharmacist out of Houston. He was the first pharmacist in the Black Panther Party. He replaced the legendary Barbara Jordan in Congress and after leaving the state legislature in Texas. And in the 1980s, and there's a point to this, 1980s, as mentioned, I'm from Brooklyn. I was looking at some statistics and noticing that Black folks and brown folks across the country were about 20 to 30% less likely to have basic telephone service in the 1980s than white Americans. I noticed that in many Indian reservations, Native American reservations, we were talking about telephone penetration of 50, 60, 70% instead of the 90% we saw in the majority population. And so working with Mickey, we started chronicling that, and we started something called the Lifeline program. Now you'll hear about Lifeline again, but Lifeline was designed to get people just basic telephone service. So in 1992, 93, and I had the great good fortune, because of Ron Brown and Bill Clinton and Al Gore, to become the first internet policy advisor to any president anywhere on the planet. Now, a lot of y'all are younger than me. Everybody's younger than me. I'll tell you how old I am. I'm old enough that I'm now old enough to get my COVID shot. And I got it my second COVID shot 2 days ago. So do the math. If you got to be over 65 and I'm on that first tier, you know my age. All right. So that's my age. I don't mind telling my age. I'm happy I've earned every one of them. But 1992, 93, when we started with the Clinton administration, I had never been on the internet. And Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and Ron Brown said, yo, bro, you're going to be our internet policy advisor. Make this thing happen. Most of the credit I get for whatever I did in that part of my life had to do with the digital divide work, and we'll talk about that. But as much as I love the work we did on digital divide, it was the work that led us to think about the digital divide that I'm really proudest of. 1993, there were no schools hooked up to the internet. There were no libraries hooked up to the internet. There were no museums hooked up to the internet. There were no police cars hooked up to the internet. There were no ambulances. There were no fire people. There were no arts creators connected to the internet. And I had a little $40 million program. I had $100 million, and then the Senate took some of it back. And so over the course of my 7 years in government, in this particular job at NTIA, I had between $100 and $100 million. We pioneered connecting schools. We pioneered connecting libraries. We pioneered connecting arts institutions. And the reason that was important was we asked people to tell us problems in their communities that they thought the internet could solve. Let's take it to the local level. I'm a Washington guy who's a lawyer who's never been on the web. I'm not going to tell somebody in Albuquerque, I'm not going to tell somebody in Cut and Shoot, Texas, what the right solutions are for their communities. We were the most popular, the most competitive grant program in the Clinton administration for 5 years, because everybody wanted to know what this internet thing was. And so we were pioneering this. On one of our trips out to California, I went out to Cupertino, California. I'm a Stanford grad, nothing personal. I love ASU, and y'all got one of my favorite people, Kenneth Shropshire, when you're doing your sports director. So I'm always gonna love ASU because you got my boy Kenneth doing some great things, and Lev is there. So how can I not love you, except on football and basketball days, but particularly women's basketball. But you know, I'm out in Cupertino, California, home of Apple. We go to this junior high school, predominantly majority. Might have been a few kids of color there, but I didn't see them the day I was there. And these kids were sitting 8 to a desktop. And every one of those kids in 1994 had a networked computer in front of them. Same day, and Lev's heard this story before, the same day I drove up to Hunters Point with Secretary Brown to a high school called Thurgood Marshall High School. Most of the kids were free and reduced lunch. Almost all of the kids were Black and brown. There might have been a few Asian students in that school, but these kids were poor kids. They were the kids I grew up with. And those kids had never seen technology. They had no idea in 1994 that a computer existed. They had no idea that it mattered to them. They had no idea that this thing that called the internet was going to change their lives. The only technology these kids saw every day were the metal detectors they walked past to make sure none of these kids were carrying a gun or a knife. So in 45-minute drive from Cupertino to Palo Alto, I'm seeing kids who are living the future and another set of kids who have no idea that this future existed. So my colleagues and I, the Commerce Department, which NTI is a huge department, and one of my sister agencies was the Census Bureau. And they do regular census. In addition to the decennial census, they do these surveys periodically. So I got one of my friends who's also from Queens, where I grew up. I'm born in Brooklyn, raised in Queens. And I said, look, I've got a few $100,000. If I give you this money, can you add a question to your next 50,000 household census? Because I want to know what we look like as a nation in terms of being connected. And that was the first digital divide report. And we did that report 3 times. And we noticed something as we watched the through lines. We noticed that if you were poor, if you were elderly, if you were rural, if you were a person of color, if you were English second language, if you were a single parent, you were less likely to have internet than if you were white, if you were affluent, if you were college educated, if you were a white collar worker. But what we also noticed was that the through line was poverty. And 22 years later, the through line with regard to who's online and who's not online, who has broadband and who doesn't have broadband, is still poverty. It's still the same problem. Now, in 1999, I was leaving the government. It was my last time presenting before Congress. And I said to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, a committee I'd worked on, I said in 1999, the digital divide is the greatest economic and civil rights issue of the decade. I said this in 1999. 22 years later, the digital divide is still the greatest economic and civil rights issue in our nation. And the pandemic has underscored that. Because when you're talking about poor people who can't get their children educated, when you're talking about people dying because they're not able to access the same telehealth technology that more affluent people can access, when you're talking about 40% of Black and brown businesses across this country having gone out of business because they don't use the technological tools that'll keep them alive. And here's a story I was telling somebody on Congress just the other day. In Washington, D.C., there's a bakery that I like, and it's called Paul's Bakery. And Paul's is still there because Paul's online. So when he had to close his shop, he was able to still do things online and still deliver and still get things online. My favorite taqueria is a truck. That guy's out of business. People aren't going to work. He's done. He's closed and gone. There's a brother I like who sells bean pies here in Washington, D.C. If you've never had a bean pie, it's an experience you should have. I know some of the Black folks will understand it. Some of the others find a Black friend and hook you up with a bean pie. But I had, my boy who's selling bean pies, he's not online. He couldn't keep his business afloat. And the point I'm trying to make is that this connectivity isn't just about Netflix. It's not about gaming. It is as important as electricity or energy or water in these days. And some communities are on the wrong side of it. I'm trying to, this year, to get people to focus on something. And I want them to stop thinking about the digital divide and start thinking about digital poverty. Because that's really the problem we're trying to solve, is the problem of digital poverty. And in a world where most of us are digitally affluent, most of us are. The folks who are digitally poor have an even harder time sustaining. PS 118 Queen. So Grace Meng, representative some of you may or may not have heard of, but she's fighting this fight in Congress now on the digital divide, along with my former boss, as it turns out, a senator named Ed Markey. But Grace Meng and I were talking, and it's funny how small the world is. I'd never met this woman before, but she and I and Jessica Rosenworcel, the new FCC acting chairman, were on a panel last week talking about these issues. And Grace Meng's kids go to the junior high school I went to. And I was bused. So that junior high school is in a relatively affluent area of New York. But we also talked about my elementary school. Almost 95% Black. It's the Harriet Tubman Elementary School. So you know this, brothers and sisters. You see Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman, you know some Black folks are somewhere involved in this thing, right? So my high school's 98% Black. 43% of those kids last year were reading a grade level below that year, last year, before the pandemic. From April till June of last year, because schools in New York go until June 30th, from April till June, more than a quarter of those kids just disappeared. Weren't at school at all. Schools were closed, they didn't have technology. You got kids who are a year behind. They're 3rd and 4th and 5th grade. They lose 3 to 4 months. Then they lose the summer. Some of them come back. What's the learning loss for those children? And how do you at 12 or 13 or 14 catch up with what you lost at 10, 11, or 12? And you're already in a community where the opportunities aren't as bountiful as we'd like for them to be. Cheryl talked about something. She talked about a restart. I had put in my notes, refocus. Restart or refocus, that's where we need to be. We have a new administration. we have a new Congress, we have a new understanding of what technology means, and we have a new energy behind getting this right this time. And there are two issues we have to look at. One is access. Y'all are in Arizona. You got a lot of folks who live in rural parts of Arizona. You have some really great cities, but you got a lot of rural folks. And it's expensive to reach the folks in rural Arizona who aren't connected. We have to spend the money to connect rural America. And I believe that fully. I'm an urban kid, but I've been in every one of the 50 states when I worked for the government. I did 17 years of my life in government. I had every one of the states, and I tried to go to places where people didn't see people like me. Government officials actually who are of color, who cared about bringing all of us back together. So it was Pikesville, Kentucky, where a bunch of white folks who'd never seen a brother with a Stanford education, I will assure you, or whether it was Cut and Shoot, Texas, or whether it was a Navajo reservation of San Ildefonso, I wanted to talk to people and find out what I could do to make this revolution, this technology revolution, meaningful to them. So let's talk about a little bit what we can do. Let's fix the problem with rural affordability, access, and spend the money to do it. But then we have a deeper problem because we have 5 million American households that don't have access to broadband internet because they can't afford it. But we have 20 to 30 million American households that don't have access to broadband internet because they can't afford it. It's a cheaper problem to solve, but it's an iterative problem because that number changes. 27% of our senior citizens in the greatest country in the world, when we're facing a disease that disproportionately impacts senior citizens, 27% of senior citizens don't have broadband at home. And when you add poverty on top of that, you're closer to 50 to 60% of low-income senior citizens don't have broadband at home. Now, why does that matter? It matters because right now in Washington, D.C., we've got to go door to door in the nation's capital in some communities to get folks who are over 65 and at risk of COVID the knowledge they need in order to get a vaccination. Because the programs to get vaccinated are all online. And you have people who neither have the technology nor the understanding of how to use it. You ever tried to do CAPTCHA? Because I got like a couple of degrees, and when they put those little crosswalks and buses and bicycles and say, hit them all, I miss them 90% of the time. Now, trying to take this to somebody 75 years old who hasn't been on the internet and say, oh, before you can get your vaccination, you got to run this gauntlet. It's crazy times. And we don't pay enough attention to the fact that what some of us take for granted, other of us have never seen. We have a chance to restart education because whatever education was in 2018, that's not what it's going to be in 2023. We have a chance to rethink and think of what's happening at ASU's campus right now. And Lev and I have had this conversation. Who is collating the lessons learned? Who's thinking about the new pedagogical methods? How are we ensuring that kids in commuter schools in Arizona, New York, Virginia are continuing to be able to connect? Because as much as a digital divide is a K-12 program, I will tell you that I gave a speech at City University of New York last year, 500,000 students, 250,000 of them in degree granting programs. And I had more than a dozen come to me after my comments and tell me how they do their homework on their iPhone, because kids at CUNY often don't have broadband at home. So on the subway to and from school, they're doing internal papers. They get to CUNY, they use the apples that are there, they load it up, and then they edit, and then they go back to their handheld. How do you do this in a world like, how is that possibly the right solution for our college students? We have a chance to refocus on that. We have a chance to refocus on commerce. We have a chance to refocus on what entrepreneurs look like, think like, and how they act. If you haven't seen GoDaddy's Venture Forward surveys, please take a look, because one of the things they're learning is that when you have a critical mass of people who are doing online ventures, it creates a community of online ventures, and that is desperately needed in Black and brown and low income and immigrant communities. If I were a benevolent despot, I'm going to stop around here so we can do some questions. If I was a benevolent despot, I would do three things. I would spend the money immediately to start deploying broadband in the hardest to reach rural parts of America. I would take the old Lifeline program, and you'll see this in legislation right now. I'd create this thing called, they have an emergency broadband benefit. Let's give people $30 or $40 or $50 now to get them connected during this pandemic. But longer term, we've got to use every tool available to have low cost or no cost broadband available in every community in this country. And the easiest way to do that near term is what I call, and friends of mine call, to and through. We've connected most schools, we've connected most libraries. I just learned that Arizona has not connected most libraries to a gig network, but in most urban areas, we've connected every library and school to a gig network. So what we should do is put a antenna on top of those schools and libraries, use the electromagnetic spectrum to create the equivalent of a Wi-Fi that's community-wide. There are municipal networks that are out there. There are all kinds of creative thinking. And again, those solutions are going to be created closer to the community, but let's start doing some community-based networking. I guess I'd add one fourth thing. Let's do some experimentation. Let's take the smartest minds in our country, ask them what problem they solve using technology. Let's run some pilot projects. Let's see what's working. There's $285 million in the last stimulus package that goes to HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and tribal colleges. The folks in those institutions know what we can and should be doing. Let's start doing it, not just start thinking about it. I want to close by saying, and take questions by saying, thank you. This matters. If we do nothing else in this country, can you imagine one scenario? It's 1935 in Alabama. You're a subsistence farmer. You happen to be Black. You look down the road and you see a white neighbor has electricity. And then you hear electric motors, and then you see he gets a refrigerator at his home. And then 4 years later, the federal government finally brings electricity to your home. That's actually what happened in the 1930s with the Depression assistance programs. In states like Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, they divided by race who got access to the technologies that would make people healthier, wealthier, and more of a part of society. We didn't do the same thing as intentionally with regard to the internet, but our poorest Americans still aren't using the most important technology of this era. Folks on this call, we can help change that. We can help people who don't understand how to use technology understand it better. We can help them chart their own course in life. This week is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. There's never been any wealth creation legislation quite like that Telecom Act. Literally trillions of dollars was created and many billionaires were created out of that act. And yet the people who really needed the wealth that the internet brings the most are still left behind 25 years later. I don't plan to have somebody look at my words from 2021, 20 years from now and say, we still haven't closed this divide. We're gonna focus on digital poverty, and I need your help, but I really appreciate your time and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Larry. There are lots of questions in the chat. I also know we've put up a bit of a Slido for folks. And of course, the room goes dark, which I will try to attend to here. Maybe I will just start, and I don't know if you want to sort of work your way through the chat, or perhaps
I'll let you work. I know I saw a lot of things coming up, but I couldn't read them while I was talking. So why don't you, if you want to be the moderator, and if I can get a recording of this later, because I do want to come back and see what I said. I hope it hung together. But I'm happy to have you and Tim answer any questions. If you want to moderate it, feel free.
Lev, do you mind if I want to kind of get us kicked off, because Larry, you touched on something that was just so personal. I was born in Mississippi and grew up in the Bronx, Jerome and Gun Hill, if you know the area.
I know it well. My family lived in Parkchester. I got family in Parkchester.
Oh, there you go. So you're right in the neighborhood.
Right there.
So, I'm reminded of historically Black colleges and universities. I attended Elizabeth City State University, and coming from a family where both my parents went to HBCUs, most of my siblings did as well. And when we relocated to Arizona, we quickly realized that, in this side of the country, there's no HBCUs. And I was curious if you had thoughts around sort of that digital divide that we were talking about, or really sort of this connecting and getting people online. It seems like there's still massive pockets of communities, like, for example, at these universities, where there's still substantial lack of connectivity and capability. And I was just wondering if you might be able to share some thoughts on that.
Are you talking about HBCUs or talking about universities in general, or?
HBCUs specifically in this particular conversation.
Elections are a wonderful thing because we got a vice president who's a graduate of HBCU, and the third most powerful person in the House of Representatives, Jim Clyburn, is a graduate of HBCU, and his daughter Mignon was one of the people that was very instrumental in what happened with the Biden telecommunications transition came. And the reality is, and you know, I've been in politics a long time, and we are at my first campaign was 1964 for Bobby Kennedy when he ran for Senate. So I've been doing this a while, and politics has never been as nasty and as partisan as it is right now, but public service has never been as important. And one of the things, by having Jim Clyburn and having Kamala Harris and having Mignon Clyburn and having people who understand the needs of these colleges, I literally, at 1 o'clock this afternoon, was having a conversation about HBCUs and 5G. The biggest problem, there are 3 problems HBCUs have. There's no endowment. I went to 2 universities, Northwestern, which has a $12 billion endowment, and Stanford has a $30 billion endowment. You could take all the HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and tribal colleges, add their endowments together, and they wouldn't be a tenth of Northwestern's. Think about that. So the wealth gap is immense. And there is another problem. And I'm going to be very candid. Back in the 1990s, when I had that little grant program, I went to presidents of HBCUs. I went to the United Negro College Fund. I went to people I knew and said, I want to hook you up early to the internet. I need you to get connected. I need you to connect your communities because once we get there, we can express. There was no interest in that because the needs were, there were so many other pressing needs. So now 22 years later, we're finally at a place where college presidents are leaning in, their CIOs are leaning in, and policymakers are leaning in. And we do have this $300 million program. I hope that we leverage that $300 million. But one of the things we need to do, and it's something that you may be able to help with tribal college and Spanish serving institutions, which are in Arizona. We don't have technology assessments. We don't know what they have. I saw a map today of what the library connectivity in Arizona looks like. Anybody have any idea of what connectivity looks like on the Native American reservations? Anybody have any idea of what the Hispanic serving institutions look like? Who can help them do the assessment of what their technology needs are from their perspective? Because you don't want to spend money until you know what the needs are. And we don't have a clue about those needs. And we certainly have a clue about those needs in HBCUs. And so what I asked them to do, and Level appreciates it, you all appreciate this, there's a brother from Stanford named Clarence Otis. He's the lead chairman of Verizon. There's another brother who's a chairman of the FCC named Bill Kennard. He's the lead director for AT&T. And I told the folks at HBCUs, call Mr. Kennard, who lives in North Carolina, and call Mr. Otis, who lives in Florida, and see what they and their $500 million foundations can do to assist one or some of you. Because most of these problems are time and money problems. We need to spend the time and the money to figure out what the problem is, and then spend the time and money to correct them. But you are so right. And then here's the other problem. When many of those kids are commuters, and they don't have the technology they need at home either. So we've got to figure out a way through Pell Grants and through other things that there should never be a student in any college anywhere in this country that doesn't have funding to make sure that he or she has broadband and a device to connect that broadband to so they can continue their education. If children are our future, like, as somebody said, kids from college, and they're 25% of our population, but they're 100% of our future. So if we're not going to make that investment, what's the point?
Wow.
That was a long answer to a question, and I hope it was responsive.
It was great.
Timothy, keep going, and put two or three questions together for Larry, because we're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure that go right ahead and pick 2 or 3 questions from the list.
Fantastic. We've got one of our most upvoted questions here. What unique opportunity does ASU have to increase internet access, especially in poorly connected communities?
You've got 304 people. I've lost 4. Where'd those 10 people go? You started with 314. So I want the names of the 10 people who signed off, because I'm coming to Arizona, because I'm now inoculated. I can come bother all of y'all. But I'd love to know who those 10 people are. You got 304 people. Each of y'all know something about technology. Each of y'all can figure out who can you help with the knowledge you have. And I would really say, can you help in low-income communities? Can you help people figure out what their problems are? Can you help connect tribal communities? Can you help an Hispanic serving institution? Can you help an immigrant community? Who are the people in your community? And can you help the state get its mapping right? Can we help do some things with regard to libraries? And I saw that there are libraries. So, you grew up in New York, you get this. I went to public schools in New York, and there's public schools and public libraries that are responsible for me getting into Northwestern, Stanford, working for the President of the United States. It doesn't happen without them. When you see that a library has 5 megabits network, how is that possibly useful for anybody using that library? And there were lots of them. I mean, like there were fewer with a gig than there were with 100 meg or less. How is that possible in a state like Arizona? So
Larry, just to share with you that the State Public Library has conducted a little bit of a survey of the libraries in Indian country. It is absolutely shameful. It's fourth world. It's kilobits per second.
And how's the kids in that reservation? How do they get to ASU? How do they change their lives if they, the library is my best, I played football so the brothers would know I was hanging out at the library, right? I will tell the story of myself. When you grew up and you know this from the Bronx, you can't tell the brothers you're going to hang out in the library because like that'll get you a beat down. So a young sister, the cutest girl in my high school class was named Virginia Ming, and she worked at the library. And I would tell the brothers I was going to hit on Virginia, who had no interest in me at all, when they saw me coming in and out of the library every day. Like, you hitting on, I'm trying, I got to do it every day, brother. And instead I was sitting there trying to do some studying because in the community I came from, academic success was not necessarily the highest accolade. So I played football. So, I didn't get to beat down on the bus, and I like football. And I went to the library every day and used Virginia Ming. And the point I'm trying to make is these libraries are essential, particularly for low-income households, particularly people who don't have a lot. I mean, you look behind me, it's books everywhere. But growing up at my house, there weren't that many. We didn't have that kind of resource. For those kids who didn't, the libraries matter. And now it's online connectivity, which we wouldn't have had because we still wouldn't have had that much money. Y'all have the capacity to change the library situation in Arizona. You really do. I mean, I don't know how you do it, but I'm looking at 300 and some odd people who care, who understand, who know it. It might be schools, it might be libraries, it might be telehealth, it might be arts, it might, listening to Warwick. And we did a virtual Chautauqua early on in my tenure at NTIA because I wanted people to understand that you could do great art online. We did a virtual museum. I showed folks the virtual Louvre and said, let's get some museums online. Let's cultivate arts online. Think about all the great native arts and the great Spanish arts and the great modern artists that you could help understand how to use technologies to expose themselves to a larger audience. We're only limited by our imaginations and by the problems we wish to solve. But what I have learned in almost 30 years of doing this, when you're passionate about something, you'll put more of your heart and more of your spare time into solving it. So what are each of you passionate about? Who do you want to help? Where can you make a difference? And what tools and talents and skills and resources do you have that you can bring to this fight?
Lev, I know we're running up against.
I'm sorry. I do soliloquies on short questions. I apologize.
No, you're great. No, it's terrific. And we should perhaps just invite you, Larry, to hang out with us as we move to conclude the agenda, if that's okay. And
can I conclude one thing? I am easily reached. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm getting off because I can't stand Zuckerberg. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. This should not be a one-off. I'd love to stay connected with whoever wants to stay connected with me, but I really want to hear more importantly, I'm hoping I hear what comes out of this. What do y'all decide to do? If I've moved any one of you and you do something, drop me a line, let me know. And if I can be helpful, if I can be a resource, if I can put you together with some people, let's do that too. This matters. And digital poverty is going to be cured in the next 2 to 3 years. That's my goal. That's my focus. I am not going to have another 22 years of not solving this problem.